In Sumer, over 4,000 years ago, high priestesses of Inanna didn't just light candles and wave incense. They were trained in astronomy, mathematics, dream interpretation, and wait for it ecstatic trance rituals where they allegedly channeled divine messages. In other words, they got high, danced, and gave out spiritual advice. You and I might call it a sacred rave with theology attached. Some were considered the divine wives of gods. And yes, that came with perks and expectations. In some cases, temple rituals involve symbolic or actual sexual rites. History calls it religion. And while male scribes recorded these practices with that special kind of awkward euphemism, the priestesses themselves likely had a far clearer idea of what was at stake. Power, protection, and the delicate management of mystery. These women were powerful. They owned land. They negotiated treaties. No, not every priestess had a steamy job description, but some did. Sacred marriage rites weren't metaphorical. Imagine the rustle of linen robes, the beat of bronze drums, the flicker of oil lamps in the holy chamber, and at the center of it all, a woman speaking in tongues, eyes rolling back, channeling what she claimed was the voice of the goddess, hidden in the temple, revered, controlled, feared, land of pyramids, crocodile gods, and dynasties with more drama than daytime television. She wasn't a passive figure. She advised her husband, corresponded with foreign kings, and was depicted as the same size as him in Arta. Big deal in a time when scale meant status. Now let's move westward, to ancient Egypt. In this world, queens weren't just consorts, they were walking symbols of fertility. A royal womb wasn't just a personal matter. It was state business. Take Queen Tai, wife of Amenhotep III. A single smile or glance could determine one's fate. But here's the twist. Even powerful queens were often reduced to one thing: their ability to produce a male heir. Or worse, her midwives blamed, her rituals questioned, her purity doubted, and heaven help you if you didn't. Their weapons were whispers, silk scrolls, and the occasional cup of poisoned tea. A queen who failed to bear sons might be quietly replaced. In the background of every royal banquet, behind every golden headdress, there were fertility tests, amulets tied to ankles, and quiet incantations whispered over moon milk and honey cakes. Not exactly glamorous, but also human. They knew how to coax a baby into the world. They knew herbs, potions, rituals, and sometimes, if gossip is to be believed, they knew how to end a pregnancy too. Now let's wander into ancient China's Forbidden City. Behind red lacquered gates, court ladies and concubines moved like ghosts trained in etiquette, music, and political manipulation. Yes, spies, and among them, spies. Some court women were planted by rival families to eavesdrop, pass messages, or even seduced for intelligence. Think of it. A woman delicately arranging her hairpin while memorizing court secrets, applying plum blossom rouge while plotting an escape route. They couldn't carry daggers in their sleeves, but they didn't need to. Hands that soothed, delivered, healed, ... And sometimes did the unspoken, who says history isn't thrilling. She was dissolving their organs with powdered herbs and a pretty smile. Let's pause in a quieter corner now. The ancient midwife, not royalty, not a priestess, but a woman with power all her own. The infamous Locusta, for example, was a professional poisoner hired by emperors. She trained others. She refined her methods. And occasional lawmakers shaped empires while pretending not to. She was so skilled, she was given a full pardon and property by Nero. In Greek, Roman, and even Babylonian society, midwives were respected and feared. To redirect, to whisper at the right moment, which meant they walked a razor's edge. Blessed one day, burned the next. Whispered too in alleyways, hired in secret, thanked in trembling hands, or betrayed to the authorities. Not scrolls, not swords, but hands. They were often illiterate, but wise, poor, but powerful, and their tools. Not all women kept to the light. Some wielded power in darker ways. In ancient Rome, poisoning was practically an art form, and women were occasionally the artists. Rebellion, romantic. No, but effective. She wasn't seducing senators. They exchanged secrets, recipes, remedies, and sometimes history remembers her as wicked. But was she, or was she just a woman who refused to be a pawn? Sometimes power doesn't wear a crown. Sometimes it wears an apron and carries a vial. There's an old saying, behind every great man. Well, let's just say in ancient Persia, Mesopotamia, and even medieval France, queens often ruled from behind the curtain, advising kings, steering diplomacy, managing court factions. Women like Roxana, wife of Alexander the Great, or Empress Theodora of Byzantium, former actress, master of public relations, cloaked in silk and shadows, holding secrets that even history couldn't erase. They learned to flatter, to speak power, softly. Let's not forget the entertainers, the dancers, musicians, storytellers. In ancient India, temple dancers known as Devadasis performed sacred rituals, but were also considered concubines of the gods, revered and exploited in equal measure. In Greece, hetairai were educated companions, courtesans, who debated philosophy and poured wine at symposiums. They weren't respectable, but they weren't powerless either. Their art, wit, and bodies gave them access that no wife ever had. They walked a strange tightrope, sacred, sensual, scandalous, and always observed. Finally, let's talk about community. Women gathered in kitchens, at wells, in sewing circles, and birthbeds. Behind every major movement, there were women passing notes, hiding fugitives, raising children to remember. History didn't write their names, but their fingerprints are everywhere. So what have we heard tonight, in these whispers behind the walls? That power doesn't always shout, that not all queens wear crowns, that not all heroes carry swords, and that behind every palace, every temple, every battlefield there were women, listening, loving, leading, sometimes in plain sight, often just beyond it. And now, as the candles gutter and your breath slows, let these women walk beside you in your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know where and when you're listening from, down in the comments. As the quiet breath of the ancient world hums in the background, we move deeper into the mysterious, veiled lives of women, those who walked through history not as loud conquerors, but as sacred keepers of tradition, discipline, and desire. Their bodies, you see, were not just biological vessels. In many ancient societies, they were treated as sacred, sinful, political, and divine all at once. And oh, the rules! Endless rules! Silent ones whispered through temple halls, bold ones chiseled into law, and stranger ones still passed through generations like lullabies of control. Imagine being a grown woman, managing a home, raising children, possibly even overseeing slaves, and yet having to ask your male guardian's permission to leave the house. Women in Athens were expected to remain indoors, unseen, unheard except during festivals, honoring female goddesses. One such festival, the Thesmophoria, was a 3-day women-only ritual celebrating fertility and Demeter. But side by side with these cosmic queens, real women were increasingly restrained. Roman matrons were expected to be the moral backbone of society. Pudicitia, or modesty, was their crown. They were seen as symbols, vessels, instruments of power, of lineage, of purity, of temptation. Midwives passed down healing knowledge from mother to daughter, hiding wisdom in herbs and lullabies. Priestesses danced sacred rites under the moon, channeling divine power in secret courtyards. Queens negotiated political alliances with a glance, a pregnancy, or a well-timed refusal. Daughters of merchants whispered to each other in market stalls, navigating gossip, love, and scandal with masterful finesse. And the rules, oh, the rules were as vast as the empires themselves. But sometimes it became a parchment for rebellion. Every hidden pregnancy, every stolen kiss, every whispered charm was a footnote in a book history rarely opened. When, how, and why a woman could speak, move, eat, love, bleed, birth, all of it's scripted by laws, customs, fears, and fantasies. Behind every temple, beneath every veil, and between every carved line of law, there were women, not passive statues, but sacred, breathing, scheming, dreaming beings. Their rules may have been silent, but their presence never was. Their bodies told stories that outlived their names. Their bodies were not for pleasure, but for lineage. Yet, beneath the layers of woolen tunics and societal expectations, some Roman women found ways to assert agency. They became poets, like Sulpicia, or healers, or even Yes, Roman women could initiate divorce, and you'd be surprised how often they did. The Manusmriti, a legal text, outlined strict codes for female behavior. Widows were discouraged from and in some case, Servo rather controversial practice of sati arose, where widows immolated themselves on their husbands' funeral pyres. A woman's life, it seemed, was often tethered to a man's death. Men weren't allowed to attend, and that, in itself, sparked rumors and fear. What did women do when the men weren't watching? Dance, pray, plot, bake something scandalous. Let's drift first into ancient Mesopotamia, where women's bodies were caught in the shifting tides of law and religion. Spartan women were bold, physical, outspoken. They exercised in the nude, ate heartily, and threw sarcastic one-liners at men who came home without shields. Their bodies were sculpted, admired not for beauty's sake, but for breeding warriors. They weren't sacred so much as strategic. Strength was sexy, weakness was wasteful, and if a Spartan husband couldn't produce strong offspring, he might be loaned a more virile comrade's services approved by the state. Of course, love, optional, reproduction, mandatory. Imagine the dusty streets of Ur echoing with the steps of priests and merchants. Women's bodies were symbols of family honor. They were bound, sometimes literally. Foot binding began during the Song dynasty as a mark of elite status. Tiny, curled feet, like lotus flowers, were thought to be the height of feminine grace. But the process, excruciating. Imagine wrapping a child's feet until the bones break, again and again, reshaping them into silence. A body reshaped to please. A girl reshaped into a wife. Beneath the sun-baked clay walls, a woman might kneel in prayer to Inanna, goddess of love and war, fertility and chaos. Some women even served as priestesses in her temples, holy women called Nadru, who took vows of celibacy and lived in seclusion, yet often held economic power, controlling land and managing business contracts. The irony, they were elevated for being unattached to men. Their sacredness came from their silence, from their stillness. Now contrast that with the infamous Code of Hammurabi, that giant slab of carved control. Women were listed among property and punishments. If a wife was accused of infidelity, she could be thrown into a river to test her innocence. Trial by drowning. Not exactly romantic. Men, on the other hand, could sleep with maidservants or prostitutes with minimal consequence. The female body, then, was a symbol of honor tipped. It didn't belong to the woman herself. It was a walking reflection of her father's or husband's reputation. And oh, how that reflection was guarded! The obsession with guarding women's purity echoed across Egypt, Greece, and Rome like a chorus sung through time. Picture an Egyptian noblewoman in crisp white linen, her kohl-lined eyes lowered as she walks the palace gardens. The ancient Egyptians, surprisingly, gave women legal rights, land ownership, divorce, inheritance. But even here, behind the elegant frescoes and perfumed tombs, expectations curled around her like a serpent in the lotus pond. Fertility was celebrated. Goddesses like Hathor and Isis were worshipped with sensual hymns, but only within the cage of marital duty. Cross the Mediterranean, and you'll find yourself in classical Athens, where women were legally children all their lives. Now slip quietly into Sparta, where the rules flipped entirely. Over in ancient China, Confucian ideals gave us the 3 obediences: be loyal to your father, then your husband, and eventually your son. In India, ancient Vedic traditions praised feminine power Shakti. Goddesses like Durga and Kali held immense power. And then, of course, we must mention Rome. Not the orgies and emperors you've seen in dramas, but the quiet, daily rules. Throughout these ancient worlds, you'll notice a trend. Women's bodies were sacred, but rarely there's true control. And yet, within these suffocating scrolls of restriction, women found ways to breathe. The body, you see, was never just a body. It was a canvas onto which the rules of society were etched. As we float forward in this tale, let us keep that in mind. Imagine, if you will, the paradox that defined this era. On one hand, there was the mighty church, a towering authority dictating moral codes, painting desire as a dangerous flame that had to be tightly controlled. Behind closed wooden doors and beneath woolen sheets, the realities of love, longing, and lust found their way. Desire did not bow to sermons. It crept into barn dances and spring festivals, into stolen glances and midnight trysts, as much part of life as bread and ale. Picture stone castles with draughty corridors, bustling markets where townsfolk exchanged Newson flirtations and humble cottages, where couples whispered under thatch roofs. Each of these spaces held secrets and stories about how people loved, connected, and navigated the intimate spaces of life. They were also about confusion and contradiction, repression and rebellion. And at the heart of it all, beating quietly like a drum beneath layers of cloth and custom, was the simple, eternal human need to connect, to touch, to be loved. The Church's teachings reached every village, every hearth, and every hearth. Sundays, the Lord's Day, were strictly off. So were Thursdays, in honor of the Last Supper, and Fridays, in remembrance of Christ's crucifixion. Intimacy was seen as permissible only within the sacred bonds of marriage, and, even then, it had a very specific purpose: the creation of children. The Church taught that husbands and wives should not indulge frequently in physical affection, lest they fall prey to lust. In fact, periods of abstinence were encouraged even within marriage to preserve purity, reflect on spiritual matters, and demonstrate control over the body's impulses. Procreation was God's intent, and all pleasure was to be a byproduct, not a goal. Other positions, particularly those thought to elevate physical pleasure or equality between partners, were frowned upon. Lovers found ways to express their affection through poetry, song, and coded gestures. Their lives revolved around the cycles of planting and harvest, of weather and celebration, and even extramarital yearning, as long as it was wrapped in poetic language and emotional restraint. Popes issued decrees. Priests reminded their flocks from pulpits and confessionals that the body was a vessel of temptation, and that true virtue lay in discipline. Yet every reminder was also an admission. The temptation never left. Knights pledged their hearts to ladies they could never touch. Queens and noble women composed verses of yearning. The ideal was not possession, but reverence. Weddings were timed with the turning of the soil. Courtship was shaped by village dances and shared chores. While they acknowledged the Church's teachings, many viewed love and intimacy as gifts of life, not burdens of guilt. In medieval times, love was not a simple act. It was a matter of theology, timing, and taboos. Yet beneath every rule was the same truth that binds us today: the longing to connect, to be held, to feel. Folk traditions told tales of love charms, fertility rites, and midsummer festivals where rules were bent or blissfully forgotten. These guides advised clergy on how to question and counsel parishioners, assigning penance for deviations. Those who renounced sexual relations altogether, monks, nuns, hermits, were praised as the purest of the faithful. Their sacrifices were seen as offerings to God. But behind the walls of cloisters, human nature often wrestled with divine instruction. There are quiet records, stories whispered in archives, of monks who fell in love, of nuns who bore secret children, and of confessions that painted a more complex, deeply human picture. A married couple might confess to enjoying each other too freely, and be assigned prayers, fasting, or even days of separation as penance. Some penitentials condemned intimacy during daylight, arguing that darkness hid shame and discouraged vanity. The missionary position became known not just for its simplicity, but for its supposed alignment with divine design. This idea seeped into law, literature, and personal conscience. Sex for enjoyment, That was suspect. Passionate desire, potentially sinful, mutual delight, carefully tiptoed around in the confessional. Saturdays often fell under the same umbrella as they prepared the soul for Sunday's holiness. Then there were the long stretches of Lent and Advent, periods of reflection and denial when all marital relations were expected to cease. It is a whisper across centuries, a gentle unraveling of a complex truth, one that tells us not just about the past, but about the enduring nature of human intimacy. These were not mere suggestions, they were considered divine mandates. To disobey was to risk sin, shame, and spiritual peril. Couples were expected to consult their spiritual guides or confessors if they were uncertain about what was permitted and when. Courtly love poetry flourished. Troubadours sang of aching devotion, and scandalous tales were told by firelight. As we explore the curious codes of love and intimacy, we must begin where nearly all aspects of medieval life were governed. Within the grasp of religious doctrine, even monks and nuns, cloistered behind abbey walls, sometimes found their vows tested by human yearning. It was the supreme authority on morality, a divine interpreter of human behavior, and the gatekeeper of both heaven and hell. Its influence touched everything: how people spoke, ate, married, and yes, how they expressed affection and desire. Sexuality, according to the Church, was a force that needed to be tightly controlled. And so, rules were written, sermons delivered, and a culture of regulation was born. Priests preached modesty, celibacy, and abstinence, casting a long shadow over personal desires. Marriage was sacred, sexuality was suspect, and sin was just a confession away. But humans, as always, are wonderfully complicated. While doctrine said one thing, daily life often said another. It's easy to imagine the Middle Ages as a cold, repressive time when affection was shackled by shame, but, in truth, it was a world of vivid contradictions. Now, as your breathing softens and your body eases into stillness, let your mind wander through that medieval tapestry. We'll explore many facets in the chapters to come. How marriage was more about property than passion. How courtly love redefined desire. How people viewed adultery, same-gender relationships, and even self-pleasure. Always mindful of the Church's watchful eye, we'll wander into bathhouses, peek into forbidden texts, and walk alongside peasants and nobles alike, discovering how they thought about body's pleasure, sin, and salvation. You see, the Middle Ages were not just about chainmail and chivalry. So, if you're ready, friend, let your worries slip away and your mind open to this fascinating tale. This is not a lecture. Now that you've settled in and the flicker of the past glows softly in your mind, let us journey deeper into the solemn halls and shadowy corners of the medieval church. The church, in medieval times, was more than a place of worship. Imagine living in a world where the calendar itself dictated when you could express love. The Church designated numerous days as unsuitable for intimacy. Add to that the many feast days of saints and holy observances scattered throughout the year, and it's easy to see that nearly half the calendar was wrapped in ribbons of restriction. But timing was only one part of the picture. The Church's ideal of sexual behavior was rigid and solemn. This doctrine cast a shadow even over the marital bed. It was not enough to be married. One had to approach intimacy with restraint and intention. Positions themselves were scrutinized. Only certain arrangements were permitted, typically those that mirrored the natural order. emphasizing the spiritual hierarchy of man over woman. Confessors kept handbooks, known as penitentials, which listed these rules in startling detail. In monasteries and convents, these teachings were doubled down upon. Celibacy was held as the highest ideal, yet despite these restrictions, desire could not be banished. It crept through cracks in doctrine like ivy through stone. Peasant communities, often less literate and more rooted in seasonal rhythms than scriptural texts, lived in tension with these edicts. Among the nobility, two contradictions bloomed. Marriages were often arranged for power, not passion, yet courtly love ideals celebrated longing, admiration. Still, the church persisted. Synods convened to revise rules. So, as you lie still, listening to the echoes of this chapter, let the weight of all this contradiction settle gently around you. There's something deeply ironic, isn't there, about beauty standards being at their most punishing just when life itself was already hard enough. Imagine grinding your own flour by hand, hauling water from a well, raising children without diapers or refrigeration, and still worrying about whether your eyeliner is perfectly smudged with crushed beetles. In ancient societies, beauty was never just vanity. It was politics, it was currency, it was control. For women, the body was a canvas, a prison, and a performance all at once. And where a girl's beauty was often measured by the size of her feet, or rather by the lack of it. Entire civilizations decided what a woman should look like, how she should smell, how she should walk, and even how long her toenails should be, and then left her to figure out how to survive while conforming to those demands. Many mothers bound their daughters' feet out of duty, whispering apologies as they pulled the cloth tighter each day. It was beauty as duty, beauty as suffering, beauty as fate. White lead was used as face polishes, the same lead we now label as poison. It gave the skin a pale, ethereal glow, a sign of wealth and nobility. Never mind the fact that it caused everything from headaches to eventual death. In the world between the Tigris and Euphrates, where cuneiform was etched into clay tablets and ziggurats scraped the sky, imagine starting your day by removing your scalp's disguise like a helmet, smoothing it with oil, and then carefully adjusting your borrowed crown. Some wigs were adorned with lapis lazuli or gold threads. In Egypt, women ground flowers, resins, and myrrh into pastes to anoint their hair and bodies. In Greece, they scented their armpits with crushed herbs. Romans dabbed their ankles and wrists with imported oils, not just to smell good, but to signal refinement. Others were simple, made of goat hair or even human hair from servants or enslaved women. In ancient Greece, a woman's body hair or lack of it was a serious social marker. The ideal woman was smooth as marble, hairless, sculptural, but razors were rare and risky. So what did they use? That's right, arsenic. Because nothing says elegance like risking your skin to please someone else's aesthetic expectations. Talk about an entrance. That ethereal movement was trained from youth. Girls were taught to walk in small, shuffling steps, knees together, eyes lowered. In China, foot binding ensured such a gait by physical force. In Europe, tight corsets and high heels made sure women couldn't run, climb, or do much beyond tottering gracefully through a garden. In India, henna painted on hands and feet signified fertility, beauty, and celebration. In Persia, kohl was both an eye cosmetic and a form of spiritual protection. In the Americas, women wore turquoise beads and inked their skin with natural dyes, some permanent, some painted on fresh each day, like armor. Meanwhile, in the bathhouses of Rome, women competed in olfactory arms, races layering so many perfumes that poets complained they couldn't smell anything else for days. Some bound their feet and became poets. Some painted their faces and ruled empires. Some wore wigs and plotted dynasties. Beauty became both a weapon and a shield, a mask and a mirror. And though the styles differed, gold tooth caps here, lip plates there, long neck coils somewhere else, the essence was the same. Mold the woman, define her worth, make her visible in all the right ways and invisible in all the wrong ones. A world where women painted their faces with poison, disfigured their feet, perfumed themselves with musk, and removed every inconvenient hair just to be seen, desired, or deemed worthy. A world where beauty was pain, and pain was invisible, just part of the ritual. If you couldn't move freely, you couldn't act freely. If your breath was shallow, your steps tiny, your ribs bruised from laces, you were delicate, decorous, dependent. Because even beauty was hierarchical, what adorned you might have come from someone with no choice. Women wore wigs as well, but with more spiritual flair. These weren't just for covering bald spots or flaunting style. Women were coached to speak softly, laugh gently, and never raise their voices unless singing, preferably while playing a lute. Wigs could be offerings to the gods, signs of mourning, or ways to mark status. Hair, after all, was sacred and seductive, something to be shown, hidden, or shaved, depending on who was watching. Vanity had its price, and it was paid in gradual suffering. Yes, that happened, and yes, it was considered luxurious. It seems the more inconvenient or animal-based a scent, the more seductive it became. Let's begin our slow, candlelit descent into one of the strangest and most quietly heartbreaking corners of history. The things ancient women did to their bodies in the name of beauty, power, and, sometimes, simply survival. She lives in a villa with sun-warmed stone floors, grapes on the table, a mosaic of Venus above the bath. But Venus isn't just the goddess of love, she's the ghost in every mirror. It was made from resin or sugar and honey, heated until molten, applied to the skin, and then yanked off with cloth. Sound familiar? Yes, the ancient world invented wax, and it was just as awful then as it is now. In wealthier homes, slave girls were assigned the task. In poorer ones, women did it themselves, sometimes using shells or pumice stones to scrape the hair away. Painful, certainly, but worth it at least, according to the standards of the day. Crushed malachite, a lovely shade of green ... Roman women bleached their hair with mixtures of wood ash and goat fat, attempting to reach that fashionable golden hue. Others opted for wigs, sometimes made of hair from defeated Germanic women. Yes, you heard right. War spoils woven into head. Your new bangs might have belonged to a slain barbarian, a kind of scalp trophy made beautiful. How's that for a fashion statement? And laced with copper, lips and cheeks were reddened with cinnabar, which sounds like something from a spice rack, but is in fact mercury sulfide. That's right, They painted poison on their faces to look alive, alluring, divine. A Roman woman's toilette was a battlefield, and her weapons were toxic. The goal was to make a woman walk with delicate, swaying steps like a flower fluttering in the breeze. It was said to be erotic, mysterious, but really it made walking painful, sometimes for life. Infections were common. Toenails dug into flesh, bones pierced the skin, but if your feet were bound, your marriage prospects soared. You were elegant, desirable, decorated in pain. Let's go east. First, to a China draped in silk, where courtyards bloomed with plum blossoms, foot binding. The words themselves sound gentle, but the practice, not even remotely. Girls as young as 4 or 5 would have their feet soaked in warm water infused with herbs, and sometimes animal blood because superstition suggested it softened the skin. Then the real work began. Each toe, except for the big one, was broken and folded underneath the sole. The arch was snapped in half. Bandages were wrapped tightly, so tightly the foot would eventually resemble a crescent moon no longer than 3 inches. They called it the Golden Lotus. Why did they do it? Some said it was for love. Others, because they had no choice. Now imagine a Roman woman. Roman cosmetics were a delightful mix of deadly and disgusting. To darken their eyebrows, Roman women sometimes used soot from oil lamps, or, if they were feeling adventurous, a mixture of ant eggs and vinegar and hair. That was an ordeal of its own. Mesopotamia was no gentler. One curious detail. Upper-class Mesopotamian women would often shave their entire heads before donning elaborate wigs. Let's talk about scent. Perfume in ancient times was more than a luxury, it was a moral shield. But sometimes it got a little out of hand. Cleopatra supposedly soaked the sails of her ship in rose oil, so the scent would reach her lover long before she did. Some perfumes were made from truly exotic ingredients. Ambergris from the intestines of sperm whales, musk from the glands of deer, or civet from breasts, yourselfter, anal glands of a type of cat. Now let's slide softly into the subject of hair removal. Modern debates about shaving seem quaint compared to what ancient women endured. A delightful invention known as drop wax. In Egypt, women plucked their eyebrows with bronze tweezers and removed body hair with depilatory pastes made of lime and arsenic. Let's not forget about posture and walk. In Japan, noble women were expected to glide, never stomp or step harshly. But the real goal wasn't just beauty, it was control. The body became a leash. Even voice was subject to beauty culture. In some ancient courts, a high-pitched, childlike voice was considered ideal. In others, a low, melodious tone. There were rituals for everything: how to dress, how to undress, how to appear untouched while being perfectly groomed. Every culture had its version of the beauty cage. So, what does it all add up to? A landscape of longing, endurance, and absurdity. And yet there's something powerful in how women reclaimed these rituals. They did what they had to. They survived. And through their painted lips and bound bodies, they whispered truths we still hear echoing today. The candle burns lower now, casting flickering shapes against stone and wood. And as the night deepens, we step quietly into another hidden realm of ancient womanhood, a realm of hushed voices, secret knowledge, and hands that brought both life and, sometimes, death. Here were women who understood what kings, priests, and philosophers so often feared: the messy, sacred, terrifying work of birth, blood, and the unseen forces thought to shape fate itself. The world of midwives, healers, and herbal witches. If ancient beauty rituals were about control of the body's surface, midwifery and healing were about its deepest mysteries. Picture it now: a small room, perhaps a clay-walled hut in a Mesopotamian village, or a smoky chamber in a Roman insula. The air smells of herbs, mugwort, rue, maybe a whiff of burnt myrrh. A wrong glance, a whispered curse from a jealous neighbor thief could doom a mother or child. Midwives bore this weight. If a birth went well, the family rejoiced. If not, suspicion turned to the midwife. Did she err, or worse, did she will it? They mixed honey and vinegar to clean wounds. They applied poultices of comfrey or yarrow to bruises and breaks. And because their cures worked or seemed to, they straddled a fine line between healer and witch. They understood garlic spite as more than flavor. It was medicine, protection, charm. They knew which teas could ease pain and which could end a pregnancy. In every village, town, or nomad camp, there was at least one woman whose hands were sought when fever struck or wounds festered. Midwives didn't just deliver babies. They prepared the mother's body with oils, massaged aching muscles, murmured charms or psalms. They anointed the newborn, cut the cord, cleaned the tiny limbs, and sometimes when the first cries didn't come, breathed life into small lungs. These women gathered herbs at dawn, dried them in bundles over smoky fires, and brewed teas that could soothe or sicken. History doesn't like to speak of this, but it happened. She saw what few others did: the bruises on a noblewoman's skin, the fear in a servant girl's eyes. They worked in the spaces between life and death, between praise and blame, between power and peril. The hidden births of illegitimate heirs, the quiet disposal of infants, unwanted or inconvenient. They walked the narrow path between reverence and ruin, knowing that without them the world could not go on. She carried these secrets like weights in her apron pocket, knowing that to speak them was to risk ruin or worse. A feverish child might be passed through a split tree at dawn, the bark tied with red thread to trap the illness. A wound might be bound with a charm as well as a bandage. A cough might be treated with honey, but only after a prayer to a household god. And the women who bore this burden paid for it in whispers, side glances, or worse. On one hand, they provided a service many quietly sought. On the other, they meddled in matters the law, the gods, or the head of the household might claim as theirs. Mandrake for love or sleep. The line between potion and prayer blurred, and so did the line between healer and witch. Their successes were expected, their failures were remembered. A woman who controlled fertility controlled destiny, and that made her dangerous. They could whisper prayers or curses, anoint a newborn, tie charms around tiny wrists. They were women of knowledge. Knowledge, as we know, was dangerous. In the center, a woman labors, her cries muffled by the thick walls. The philosopher Socrates famously said his own mother had been a midwife, guiding babies into the world as he tried to guide souls to truth. In ancient times, the line between healer and witch wasn't just finite, was invisible until crossed. A woman who could cure your sick child was a blessing unless she cured too well, or refused, or failed, then she was a threat. But while Socrates could philosophize in the public square, midwives worked in shadows, welcomed when needed, shunned when feared, and beside her, another woman older, perhaps, or simply wiser in the ways of the body, a woman who knew too much, who healed too well or harmed too cleverly, might be celebrated in one breath and condemned in the next. Linen cloths, clay pots of oil, sharpened reeds for cutting cords, herbs by the handful, pennyroyal, silphium, or blue cohosh, depending on the region and era, a carved amulet to ward off evil spirits, perhaps a small statue of a goddess, Isis, Artemis, or Eileithyia, patroness of birth, the midwife, the first doctor most people would ever meet, the last face seen by many who didn't survive. Midwives were respected, feared, and sometimes both. They were there at the start of life, and, often enough, at its end. In ancient Greece, midwives were called Maiai, and were often former mothers themselves, women who had borne children and lived to tell the tale. And what of the tools of their trade? Forget gleaming instruments or sterile gloves. The ancient midwife's toolkit was humble and strange. Superstition wrapped around childbirth like a second umbilical cord. The right words had to be spoken. The right charms hung over the door. And then there were the healers, the herbal women, the bone setters, the ones who knew the quiet magic of leaves and roots. They knew the power of willow bark to dull pain long before aspirin would be synthesized. Their knowledge came from generations of practice, from trial and error, from whispered advice passed mother to daughter. Ah, witches! The word itself hums with centuries of fear, fascination, and misunderstanding. Consider the women of ancient Rome who brewed herbal contraceptives or in medieval Europe, centuries later, this tension would explode into witch hunts. But even in the ancient world, seeds of suspicion were sown. Let's return to the birth chamber, that small world where blood, breath, and hope mingled. And yes, sometimes they carried out the darkest tasks. In desperate times, or at desperate requests, they might end a life before it began, using herbs or more direct means. Beyond birth and death, the healer's world was rich with ritual. Herbs weren't just medicine, they were magic. Mugwort to protect from evil, rue for cleansing. Imagine, too, the midwife's role as witness to secrets. And so midwives became both trusted and mistrusted. They were necessary, but not always welcomed. They could be saviors or scapegoats. In every culture, from the streets of Athens to the villages of ancient India, these women shared one truth. Their work was invisible until it wasn't. And still they persisted. They brewed, bandaged, blessed. They risked their lives to ease others' pain. They were the hidden hands that shaped history, the quiet guardians of life and death, the witches, healers, and midwives whose names are lost but whose work echoes even now. The story continues, almost as if whispered through the threadbare walls of a clay-walled house, or beneath the humming voices of a market crowd. If you listen closely, past the clatter of armor and the sweeping declarations of emperors, past the solemn chants of priestesses or the seductive language of royal court politics, you will hear another kind of rhythm. The scratch of weaving looms, the splash of water in a worn ceramic basin, the shuffle of feet across dirt floors, carrying bundles of grain, jugs of wine, or babies that do not belong to them. This is where we go now, not into palaces, but into kitchens, markets, sweat-darkened workshops, and backfields behind temples. Because if history is a grand feast, the women in this chapter were the invisible hands who cooked it, served it, and cleaned up afterward. Quietly, efficiently, and often without recognition. Let's begin with the marketplace. It's early morning in ancient Mesopotamia, and the sun has barely crept above the horizon. The city of yore is beginning to stir, and women, most of them wrapped in linen tunics with baskets balanced expertly on their hips, are already negotiating the price of barley, garlic, and dates. You'd think this was a quick stop. It isn't. This is an art form. A woman who knows how to haggle is worth her weight in wine, and many of them do. With sarcasm sharp enough to make a merchant wince. These weren't idle housewives idling round the stalls. Women were the economic engine of local trade. While men might have controlled land titles and long-distance trade caravans, women ruled the urban stalls. They sold beer, bread, fabric, ointments, cheese, and sometimes, depending on the region and time period, oven, magical charms. These transactions didn't just keep bellies full, they stitched society together. Now, let's shift to ancient Rome. The grandeur of marble columns and grand speeches. But follow the smoke rising behind the villas, and you'll find the kitchens. That's where the real action happened. Female slaves and servants managed entire pantries, coordinated enormous meals, and served everyone else long before they fed themselves. They were cooks, bakers, nurses, laundresses, wet nurses, caretakers of children, and caretakers of the old. They were the first ones up and the last ones to rest, and no one remembered their names. And then there were the looms. Oh, the looms. If there is a soundtrack to female labor in antiquity, it might be the soft clack of loom weights swinging. Under tension, weaving was not just busy work, it was survival. Cloth was currency. A woman could clothe an entire family and still be expected to produce fine linen for temples, offerings, or taxes. In ancient Egypt, elite women sometimes even managed textile workshops, but for most it was unpaid, invisible work. And yes, husbands could legally claim the profits of their wives' weaving. Of course, let's talk about slaves. Specifically, enslaved women. They were the backbone of domestic labor, the silent army behind ancient luxury. In Greece and Rome, in China and Mesopotamia, female slaves bore the burden of raising other people's children, washing other people's clothes, and quite often serving as concubines whether they wished to or not. In many households, slave women breastfed noble babies while their own children went hungry. Think about that. Producing the milk of life while being denied the right to raise your own child. These were not isolated tragedies, they were systems. Systems that fed empires while draining the bodies and souls of the women within them. Yet, it wasn't all submission. History, even the quiet kind, leaves room for rebellion. Some women resisted. Some ran. Some left behind scraps of evidence. The Egyptian servant girl who etched a rude poem about her mistress into the walls of her workroom. Or the Roman nursemaid who named herself in a funeral inscription, demanding to be remembered just once by name. And in the quieter corners of ancient cities, women formed mutual aid networks, informal webs of shared knowledge, labor exchange, midwifery, even underground herbal medicine. When laws excluded them and temples overlooked them, they formed their own sacred spaces, around the hearth, over baskets of lentils. Beside the well, we often ask, what was it like to be a woman in ancient times? But perhaps a better question is, what was it like to keep the world running? knowing you would not be thanked. What was it like to cook, clean, nurse, and weave while statues were built for men who merely shouted orders? They say history is written by the victors, but empires were held up by hands so calloused, so gentle, and so tireless that they vanished into myth. This chapter is for them. Now, let's move east across the desert winds of the Fertile Crescent, through the ziggurats and scrolls of ancient Assyria and Babylonia, where women labored in temples not just as priestesses, but as bakers, brewers, and keepers of offerings. Yes, the gods required their daily bread, and it was women who needed it in temple kitchens long before sunrise. They would rise sleep still clinging to their lashes, skin dry with flour, dust, and begin the sacred work of shaping barley loaves and sweet date cakes. Not because they were hungry, but because the gods demanded pastries, and the priests demanded women to make them. Sometimes this labor was cloaked in divine purpose. In others, it was simply unpaid obligation. The same was true in early Chinese dynasties. The women in the background of the Bronze Age Shang courts were more than passive ornaments. They were silk workers, cooks, and textile weavers, raising food from rice paddies and children from cradles, almost always in silence. The empress might have a name, Fu. How comes to mind? A rare woman who held military power, but the dozens of women beneath her. No names, no stories, only calloused hands. There's something hypnotic about the repetition of ancient labor, the act of grinding grain on a stone slab, hour after hour, day after day, the act of fetching water from a distant well, the sound of cloth being beaten against rocks by the riverbank. Imagine a world where your day was not organized by appointments or alarms, but by the weight of what your body had to carry. And carry, and carry. You might think that life as a queen or noblewoman was easier, and yes, perhaps it came with silk robes and golden anklets. But make no mistake, those comforts came with rules, with servants to manage, reputations to maintain, and households to control. Being a noblewoman meant performing the ideal of grace, while still ensuring that 20 mouths were fed and the floors were scrubbed spotless. Royal women were expected to know the recipes for incense and perfume. They supervised palace laundry and ensured food stores were rotated. Some even maintained ledgers of food and grain, serving as logistical officers in silks and jewelry, because while kings waged war, someone still had to make sure the palace had clean socks and dried figs. Now, let's talk about wet nurses. It's one of those ancient jobs that sounds gentle and warm until you really look at it. Imagine being a young slave woman in ancient Rome or Greece. Your child is a few weeks old. Your milk is flowing, but your infant is taken away. You're sent away and instead, you are assigned to breastfeed another baby. A noble child, perhaps. A senator's daughter, a merchant's newborn son. You feed the child as if it were your own. Your arms know the shape of it. Your milk nourishes it. But it is not yours. Sometimes these women formed bonds with the children they nursed. Some even became honorary family. But often they were dismissed when the child was wind-cast aside, like an empty jar. Their own children, if they lived, might never know the sweetness of their mother's milk. And then there were the laundresses. In ancient Egypt, they had to haul enormous basins of water, soak garments in clay and natron, a kind of early soap, and beat them on smooth stones in the heat. Picture the red, raw hands, the sunburnt arms, the scent of sweat and soap and wet linen curling into their lungs with every breath. Even in the medieval era, this role didn't change much. In fact, laundresses became famous for their strength, their biting humor, and their unfortunate reputation for being coarse. Why? Because they did the dirty work. Because they had no time to smile while scrubbing out other people's filth. In many cultures, female labor was so expected, so constant, that it vanished into the walls. The job of a woman was not one job, it was every job. She was a cook, a cleaner, a nurse, a wet nurse, a seamstress, a scribe, in rare cases, a brewer, a weaver, a mother, and a manager of chaos. And yet, history never really paused to thank her. There are no statues of anonymous mothers beside cradles. No temples built for the laundress who worked through plague years. No epics sung for the woman who taught 3 generations how to braid rope or make lentil stew. Even in societies that revered goddesses Isis in Egypt, Inanna in Mesopotamia, Athena in Greece, the labor of mortal women was often considered too mundane to be divine, too ordinary to be extraordinary. But there were exceptions. In ancient Sparta, for instance, women were expected to train their bodies to become strong, mothers of strong sons, and in the absence of their husbands, who were perpetually at war, Spartan women ran estates, oversaw harvests, and even controlled property. In Viking settlements, women kept the homesteads alive while the men were off raiding. They weren't just cooking stew. They were forging tools, managing livestock, and preparing for the long, brutal winters. And in feudal Japan, the Onobugashefi male warriors took up the naginata to defend their homes, while other women kept entire rice fields thriving through monsoon and drought alike. So yes, women worked. They labored in the shadows and in the sun. They bled, brewed, braided, buried. They sang lullabies while twisting grain into porridge, and whispered prayers while scrubbing the blood out of linen. Their feet were cracked from stone floors. Their arms bore babies and baskets in equal measure. And their names, often lost, but their echoes remain in the patterns of old looms, in the faded edges of market ledgers, in the ashes of cook fires long gone cold. This was labor not measured by coin or praise, but by the weight of each day survived. So as you lie here, perhaps drifting off beneath blankets made by other hands, perhaps warmed by tea brewed in a cup that once reminded someone of home, know that the world you sleep in tonight was built by invisible labor. Quiet, relentless, and sacred. Not with marble, not with iron, but with the steady, unbroken rhythm of women at work. If you've ever imagined that love in ancient times was all stolen glances across palace courtyards or poetic sighs beneath the stars, well, you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But you'd also be missing the mess, the awkwardness, the danger, the thrill of things whispered behind curtains, the quiet scratching of messages hidden beneath wax seals, the silent risk of hearts and lives tangled in secrets. You see, love for ancient women was rarely simple. It was a tangle of duty and desire, of arranged matches and reckless hopes. The world told them whom they could marry, whom they must marry, and whom they could never even dream of loving. But the heart listened to no laws. In the grand halls of ancient Rome, a noblewoman might have a husband 3 times her age, a match made not for passion, but for property, alliances, and the preservation of family honor. His breath might smell of stale wine, his fingers heavy with rings that weighed as much as his expectations. But still, behind the columns and statues, that same noblewoman might slip letters to a poet, or a gladiator, or a clever slave who made her laugh when no one else dared. Those letters, wax tablets smuggled in hems of tunics, messages written in citrus juice that only appeared when warmed over a flame. Love, lust, longing, hidden in plain sight, as fragile as a moth's wing, and just as easily crushed if discovered. And what of the married woman in ancient Greece, cloistered behind high courtyard walls, her world confined to looms and ledgers. Sometimes her heart escaped through poetry, through lines murmured at night, written in dust or on scraps of discarded papyrus. And sometimes it escaped more dangerously in trysts with neighbors or visitors, with all the risk of ruin. Should the wrong eyes see? Let's linger for a moment on those ancient love poems, verses written by women, or perhaps imagined by men who longed to hear what women might say if free to speak. In Sappho's lines, love is both sweet and painful, a fire that consumes and a bomb that soothes. Her words survived the centuries, though most of her poems did not lost to flame, rot, or deliberate silence. What remains is like a broken melody, half remembered, but still haunting, and still the rules. The endless rules. In imperial China, a concubine might rise to great power if she bore a son, or fall into ruin if she lost the emperor's favor. She was one of many, part of a delicate and dangerous dance of affection, politics, and rivalry, forbidden to love another, forbidden to refuse the emperor, yet sometimes daring to dream of a private happiness. Hidden, impossible. And what of same-gender love? Our history tried to bury that too. But it flickers through the cracks, in the poetry of Greek women, in the stories of noble Japanese ladies who exchanged fans and secret promises. These bonds, tender and quiet, sometimes survived in the spaces where men weren't looking. Sometimes they didn't survive at all. Adultery. Well, let's just say the punishments were rarely fair. A man's straying might be shrugged off, especially if he had coin to spare or power to protect him. A woman's straying, discovered, could mean exile, disgrace, or death. Yet still, they strayed. They risked it. Because the heart, as we've said, does not read law books. So, as we pause here, imagine that candle flickering low. Imagine the weight of all those hidden desires, those stolen moments. Imagine a world where love was as dangerous as it was sweet, and ask yourself, would you have dared? Let us now wander deeper into the shadowy folds of ancient relationships, not the kind written about in royal decrees, but the kind scribbled in margins or passed down in stories half remembered by old women with knowing eyes. Imagine a girl in ancient Mesopotamia, not a queen, not a priestess, just a girl who worked in the temple granary. Her marriage was arranged before her first blood. Her husband chosen not for his gentleness, but for the wheat fields his family owned. But what of her heart, her dreams? When she walks to market, her eyes linger on the young man who plays the reed pipe by the gate, or perhaps the soft-voiced girl who sells figs and watches her a moment too long. The gods of her city may command obedience, but her soul is a field where wild things still grow. In ancient Egypt, love spells weren't just myths, they were real, etched into pottery shards, written in ink made from ochre and desire. A woman might whisper incantations over a piece of hair, burn it with frankincense, and hope her chosen one would come knocking. It was as much superstition as it was an act of rebellion, claiming love in a world where she often had no choice. And in the corners of the Roman Empire, you'd find tablets buried near shrines, curses and pleas scratched in crude Latin, by hearts broken or betrayed. May his manhood fail, reads one. May she forget the taste of his kiss. These weren't just gossip, they were the echoes of ordinary people trying to bend fate. Even in a world of strict roles and severe punishments, people found ways to reach for love, even if it meant risking their lives or someone else's. Now, let's step into the veiled quarters of an Ottoman harem, not the overblown fantasies told by 18th-century travelers, but the real, complex world where women lived, sometimes ruled, and sometimes longed. In these closed palaces, love might flicker quietly between women who shared their days, their sorrows, and their dreams. It might bloom in secret between a servant girl and a eunuch guard who'd trade poetry through the slats of a screen. Or it might wither entirely, crushed under rules older than memory. And then there's Japan, Heianira, with its fluttering sleeves and layered silks. Their romance was an art. Lovers measured affection in calligraphy and incense. A woman might judge a suitor not by his face, but by the scent he left behind on her pillow. Still, it was a society full of rigid class lines and arranged unions. True love had to be clever, poetic, and above all, secret. Let us not forget the sacred brothels, yes, sacred of some ancient cultures. In Sumer, temple prostitutes were believed to serve the goddess Inanna. Their intimacy wasn't shameful, it was divine. Pleasure and spirituality tangled like vines on a column. Later, of course, those ideas were buried, rewritten, or demonized, because control over women's bodies has always been a battlefield. Now, picture a quiet farmhouse in medieval France. A peasant woman, broad-handed and sun-warmed, married to a man who smells of sweat and iron. But once a year, when she walks to town for market day, she meets a mason with laughing eyes. Their hands never touch, but something happens in the silence between glances. Is it love? Is it betrayal? Is it anything at all? These small romances, tiny, trembling things, lived and died unnoticed, yet they mattered. They still matter. Not every love story was poetic, of course. Some were messy, unkind, even cruel. Power often shaped affection, just as it shaped everything else. A Roman general might take what he wanted, calling it love. A pharaoh might issue marriage like a decree. And yet, within that same palace, two chambermaids might carve their names beside a secret spring, promising each other forever. Love, in the ancient world, was always layered, public and private, sacred and profane, and desire. It flowed like a river beneath the surface of laws and doctrine. It slipped into dreams. It hid in songs. It danced in the way someone reached to pass a cup or tightened a sash. Even the most rigid societies couldn't banish it completely. As we pause again, close your eyes and imagine a world where love could mean exile, where a kiss could destroy, a family where poetry was sometimes the only safe place to say what you felt. And still, they loved. They always did. Softly now, we enter the final hall of this shadowed gallery, where hidden passions were painted in layers of secrecy, danger, and sometimes survival. Love in the ancient world was not merely about attraction or romance. It was a rebellion, a game, a performance, and occasionally a quiet triumph. Let us begin with the concubines. In imperial China, concubinage was legal, normalized, and deeply layered in political strategy. A concubine was not a wife, but not quite a mistress either. Her power depended on the emperor's gaze. If she bore him a son, she rose. If not, she might live out her days in elegant obscurity, reciting poetry to her shadows. But within those delicate silks and perfumed corridors, there were whispers. Sometimes between concubines, sometimes between servants, sometimes between a lonely woman and a eunuch who had no body left for passion, only ears, poetry, and sympathy. These were loves born not in lust, but in need. Soft rebellions curled beneath the rigid order of dynasty, and what of the laws? The punishments? Let us be frank, the laws were often brutal. In ancient Rome, a married woman caught in adultery could be divorced, shamed, and exiled. Her lover, if he was of lower class, he could be killed. In Greece, Female adultery was sometimes punished with confinement or mutilation, while a husband's infidelity, well, that was usually just a shrug and a sigh, because double standards weren't invented yesterday, and yet, despite the risks, forbidden love bloomed. In gardens, behind temples, under the canopy of servants' quarters. It flowered in gestures, a dropped handkerchief, a lingering look, a sandal turned just slightly toward another's. A woman in Babylon might use coded bracelets or embroidered symbols on her tunic to send messages. A young Greek courtesan might read love poems in public, knowing full well who they were really meant for. In the markets of Carthage, a widow might fall in love again, with a seller of dates, or with the woman who ran the apothecary stall next door. Their fingers might brush while weighing figs. Their conversations, innocuous to others, might carry years of longing. These were loves that left no official records, only bones, ashes, and legends. And sometimes, love changed the course of history. Think of Cleopatra, not the seductress invented by Renaissance painters, but the brilliant, multilingual strategist who dared to choose lovers like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, not only for politics, but perhaps for pleasure, companionship, or, imagine, genuine affection. Her relationships weren't just tactical. They were dangerous, human, and far more layered than the propaganda suggests. There's something deeply moving about how people tried to preserve love, even when it wasn't allowed. The frescoes of Pompeii, buried in volcanic ash, revealed couples in moments of closeness. Not just gods and goddesses, but real people, embracing the lovers of Faldaro. Two skeletons buried face to face, arms intertwined. Were they a couple? Siblings? No one knows. But the pose speaks for itself. Someone wanted to die touching someone else. And what of women who loved women? Or men who loved men? Despite modern assumptions, same-gender relationships were not rare, but they were complex. In some cultures, they were sacred. In others, ignored. In others, still, criminal. In ancient Sparta, love between male warriors was believed to strengthen battle bonds. In Rome, relationships between older men and young boys were formalized, if ethically disturbing by modern standards. But what about women? Their loves were often less documented, not because they didn't exist, but because men didn't write about them. Yet poems survive. In ancient China, women wrote verses to each other with phrases like fragrant sleeves, entangled, or I dreamed you held my waist again. In Sappho's Greece, women on the island of Lesbos shared music, writing, and touch. The church later buried those stories under centuries of silence. But silence, too, is a kind of evidence. Now, let's step into the world of erotic art and objects. Did you know ancient Romans kept small statues of lovers in various positions as part of household decor, or that in Japan's Edo period, pillow books were filled with tender and explicit illustrations? These weren't shameful. They were educational, celebratory, even spiritual. Love and desire weren't always tucked behind shame. Sometimes they were carved in ivory and passed down through generations. In India, temples like Khajuraho celebrated intimacy with carvings so detailed they'd make modern audiences blush. These were not hidden away, but displayed on sacred walls, reminders that the divine and the carnal were not so far apart. And yet, despite all this celebration, control remained the constant shadow. Virginity was often demanded of women, not for health, but for ownership. A woman's untouched body was seen as her father's honor, then her husband's. Love, outside that framework, dangerous. A woman who followed her heart was often branded a harlot, a temptress, or worse. Some chose to run. Some were caught, some vanished into stories that end with silence, but not all. Some carved their names into the bricks of eternity. Some wrote poetry, led rebellions, or passed down recipes for love potions hidden in pages of herbal lore. Some simply lived and loved without permission. And so we end this section with a final thought. Love, in the ancient world, was often tangled in power, punishment, and silence, but it was also undeniably present. It defied borders, classes, and laws. It endured in whispers and glances, in poems and ruins, in bones buried side by side. You, listener, are the witness now. Let the stories echo through you, not loudly, but softly, like a kiss never seen, like a hand held in the dark. Imagine it, the ancient world, full of strict codes, invisible boundaries, and expectations as heavy as temple stones. And yet, in every generation, there were women who quietly or spectacularly refused to play by the rules. Some paid the price, some didn't. All left echoes we can still hear if we listen closely enough. Let's start with runaway wives. It's easy to picture ancient marriages as unbreakable chains, and often that's what they were. But sometimes women simply ... walked out. In ancient Mesopotamia, there are records of wives who left their husbands and tried to claim independence. One clay tablet recounts a woman who left her husband, lived alone, and even opened a shop until her family dragged her back. In ancient Rome, a wife could initiate divorce if she was wealthy or powerful enough. But for most women, leaving meant risking poverty, disgrace, or worse. And what about those who disguised themselves as men? It sounds like a plot from a folk tale, but it happened. Women who dressed in male clothing to escape, to travel, or to fight. Consider Hua Mulan. Yes, we all know the legends, but there were real women, too, who slipped on armor to join the fray. In medieval Europe, Joan of Arc famously donned soldier's garb, but she wasn't alone. Chronicles tell of women who fought as pirates, mercenaries, or simply to protect their homes. And when they were discovered, some were praised, many were executed. But for a time, they stepped beyond the lines drawn for them. The pirate queens. Grace O'Malley, for example, ruled the waves off Ireland's coast in the 16th century. She commanded ships, negotiated with queens, and defied the English crown. Not a figure of ancient times, but her spirit was shared by earlier sea women, Phoenician traders' wives who sailed with their husbands, or Mediterranean women who ran smuggling rings behind respectable facades. Let's wander to the courts now, those hallowed halls of rules, titles, and whispering courtiers. Here, too, women rebelled. There were queens who seized power during regencies, turning temporary rule into lifelong command. There were consorts who spread rumors, manipulated successions, or forged alliances forbidden by law. And there were exiles, women sent away from court because they were too dangerous, too beloved, or too clever. Some lived out their days in distant villas, writing letters and plotting quiet revenges. Others vanished from the record, their names rubbed out, their portraits defaced, but not their stories. Consider the divorced and discarded in ancient Japan. A woman might be dismissed by a noble husband with a simple letter. In Rome, a wife, accused of adultery, could be cast out of the home, sometimes forced to return to her father's house in shame. But some of these outcasts remade their lives. They became poets, midwives, or even heads of their own households. One Roman matron, banished for alleged infidelity, built a profitable textile business and left her fortune to her daughters. And of course, there were those who fled beyond the reach of civilization. In ancient desert lands, abandoned wives or Rebellious daughters sometimes found refuge in hermit communities, hidden temples, or bandit camps. The line between exile and freedom blurred. Imagine a woman once draped in silk, now wrapped in rough wool, standing on a mountaintop, unafraid. She was no longer a daughter, a wife, or a queen. She was herself, untethered, unnamed. Let's not forget the intellectual rebels, women who wrote forbidden poems, studied banned philosophies, or taught dangerous ideas. Hypatia of Alexandria, mathematician, philosopher, and teacher, who met a brutal end at the hands of a mob, her learning seen as a threat. Or Sappho, whose love poems survived despite centuries of attempts to erase her name. And what about the quiet rebels? The women who simply did not conform, who chose not to marry, who chose not to bear children, who chose their friends, their lovers, their gods, against society's wishes. Their rebellions left no monuments, only tiny marks in the records, hints in legal codes designed to stop them. In ancient Babylon, clay tablets whisper about priestesses who broke their vows, women who used temple connections to amass property, only to be cast out into the far desert edges of society. One account, nearly worn smooth by time, describes a woman sentenced to live outside the walls, her name to be unspoken. And yet her story is still with us. There's something strangely powerful in that. She vanished, but she didn't disappear. In Greece, women who defied the rules might be declared atomia, a kind of social death. They could no longer attend public rituals, walk unescorted, or even legally inherit. But some of them, some found a second life. There were sanctuaries in the hills. There were sacred brothels where exiled women could remake themselves as priestesses of a different kind, sacred or scandalous. It depended on who was doing the judging. That exile didn't always mean solitude. In parts of pre-Islamic Arabia, exiled women became the center of entire desert communities. A widow with no male guardian might gather outcasts, former slaves, and illegitimate children, offering shelter in exchange for loyalty. What began as punishment sometimes turned into leadership. Let us not forget the unwed mothers, a scandal in any ancient society but not always a death sentence. In some Egyptian villages, women raised children alone and supported themselves with brewing, weaving, and sometimes divination. Midwives whispered that a child born of no man was sacred. Others said it was cursed. Either way, the mother stood at the edge of society, neither welcomed nor entirely erased. And now, imagine the desert caves of Syria and Egypt, where early Christian ascetics went to live in isolation. Among them were women wrapped in cloth, heads shaved, calling themselves monks. Some passed as men, some didn't bother. They lived in harsh silence, battling hunger, visions, and the deep weight of being unwanted by the world they left behind. In northern China, exiled imperial concubines were often sent to remote provinces. Some were assigned to temples. Others were quietly absorbed into local aristocracy, bearing children whose names would never appear in official genealogies. They became the mothers of forgotten branches of great dynasties, anonymous but powerful in their own hidden ways. There were even whispers of women who faked their own deaths to escape oppressive marriages or religious vows. One legend from medieval France tells of a noblewoman who staged a funeral for herself, with a hired actress. In the casket, she then fled in disguise and reappeared decades later as an herbalist in Italy. No one ever proved the tale, but the rumors persisted and were recorded in curious church margins like gossip too delicious to burn. Even the concept of witches was, in many ways, about rebellion. These weren't always women flying on broomsticks, or cackling in forests. Often, they were simply widows who didn't remarry, or midwives who knew too much about life and death, or women who read stars and brewed teas and declined to be controlled. They were accused of dancing with the devil. But what they were really doing was surviving outside the walls. Beyond the reach. In ancient India, there were the Sanyasinis, female renunciants, who left family, children, society, and even caste to walk the land barefoot. They lived on alms, slept under trees, and taught philosophy in the shade of ruined temples, sacred or disgraceful. That too depended on the audience. In Africa, among certain tribes, there were women who became men by social status. They took wives, governed households, and dressed in male clothing. These weren't gender transitions as we define them today, but powerful rejections of the expected script. The world saw a woman and expected obedience. She saw the world and said no. There were also women who were too educated. In ancient Rome, if a woman spoke Latin too fluently in public, she might be accused of being morally dangerous. In some cases, young girls with a talent for poetry or rhetoric were quickly married off to silence them. Others escaped into convents or became traveling performers, weaving politics and protest into their songs. And then there were the stories of women who burned their own homes rather than be married off, or who vanished into forests to join outlaw bands, or who, as legend has it, simply walked into the sea, letting the waves erase every rule ever written for them. But not all outcasts were tragic. Some were simply tired. A Babylonian letter tells of a woman who, after decades of marriage, walked into the marketplace, declared herself unmarried, and never looked back. She became a wine seller, a gossip magnet, a fixture of the town. The priests frowned, but the people loved her. Some rebels wielded charm instead of blades. They seduced kings, disrupted alliances, and shaped policy from behind veils and curtained beds. When exile came, they didn't run. They retired with gold, letters, and possibly more influence than when they ruled. These were the ones who understood power as a dance. They danced until they chose to leave the floor. And still, through all this, the voices of these women were often erased. Their names scratched out, their portraits overpainted, but the outlines remained, like ghost images on faded parchment, like perfume on a robe long buried, like footsteps that echo after the corridor is empty. Their stories matter not because they are loud, but because they are human, because rebellion isn't always fire and battle cries. Sometimes it's silence, a step taken, a letter left behind, a name refused, a dress not worn, a lover not chosen. Good history is rarely loud. It's quieter than we expect. Sometimes it lingers in the rustle of fabric, the scent of herbs long faded, or the shape of a footprint in stone worn down by centuries of steps. In this final chapter, we won't shout the names of queens or count victories in battles. Instead, we'll listen, softly, for the whispers that remain, the echoes of the women who lived, loved, worked, plotted, bled, healed, and ruled often in secret. Their names may not be carved into triumphal arches or sung in epic poems, but their fingerprints are everywhere. Let us begin, not with a monument, but with a thread. In ancient Egypt, the linen used to wrap a mummy was often spun by women. Their labor, quiet, repetitive, invisible, was wrapped around every king. Some cloth still bears fingerprints. So yes, while we remember the pharaohs, it's the hands of women's autors, weavers, servants who stitched their legacy together, strand by strand. In Mesopotamia, temples kept dusty ledgers. They tell us who donated grain, who owed the priestess a favor, who delivered a child at sunrise. And in those ledgers we find female scribes rare, yes, but present, writing the record, inserting themselves, even subtly, into the mechanism of memory. Across the sea, in Minoan Crete, murals show women with raised arms, serpents coiled at their wrists, eyes fixed on eternity. We do not know their names, but we know their shape. And shape, in the end, is something the soul recognizes more deeply than sound. Even the myths, those slippery half-truths, tell us something. Eve, Pandora, Lilith, women at the edge of creation, bringing both chaos and curiosity. These tales were warnings, or invitations, depending on who was listening. They were painted as origin points of disobedience. But what is disobedience if not an assertion of presence? In the Roman world, gravestones whisper secrets to who? A woman named Julia Balbilla inscribed poetry on the legs of the Colossi of Memnon. She was a poet, noble-born, witty. She wrote about travel, desire, and the gods. Her verses are still there, carved into ancient stone. Not erased, just waiting. Centuries later, in early Christian catacombs, we find images of women standing with their arms raised in the orans, pose prayerful, powerful, unashamed. They are unnamed, but their poses suggest authority, perhaps even leadership. Hidden beneath cities, they remind us that sacredness was never truly a man's domain. The echoes deepen when we follow the forgotten through the margins. In the illuminated manuscripts of medieval Europe, scribes doodled, sometimes they drew, nuns chasing devils with spoons, women riding fish, queens with dragon wings. Were these jokes, fantasies, satire, or the suppressed voice of someone who had far more to say than the church allowed? History may try to flatten, but the margins remain defiantly weird. There's an Armenian chronicle that mentions a woman general just once. Her name is given no backstory, no lineage. But she is recorded as having led 300 soldiers into a mountain pass to hold back an invading force. They held. That's all we're told. The chronicle moves on. But she stays with us in feudal Japan. Scrolls tell of Onabugashia women of the warrior class trained in the naginata and tactics, not as a novelty, but as necessity. Some took their own lives in ritual suicide when defeat came. Others led retreats, saved children, and rebuilt entire families in the aftermath of war. One fought until she was 70. Her name was Tomo Gozen. Her story was nearly lost to time. And still, there are the ones we don't even know by name. A clay figurine buried in a field. A sandal found beneath the floorboards of a forgotten harem. A strand of dyed wool still knotted in an ancient comb. These are not grand relics. But they are evidence that someone lived, that someone was here. Someone who probably didn't expect to be remembered. History tends to elevate the loudest voices, the men with swords, the kings with scribes, the saints who were martyred, the generals who marched. But what of the women who carried everything else? They carried children and baskets and secrets. They carried burdens of silence and the weight of watching others take credit for what they'd grown, spun, brewed, or bled for. Let's return to the medieval world, not through its battles, but through its kitchens and birthing rooms and convents. In France, a peasant woman named Jehon was fined for brewing ale without a license. And yet her ale was better than the abbeys. The records show her name appears once, her recipe never again. But the church wanted its cut. Women were powerful when they fed people, and therefore dangerous, in a Norse saga. There's mention of a side connoisseuress who wore a blue cloak embroidered with stones. She came to villages with her staff, her catskin gloves, and her eerie, distant voice. She sang the future. Men feared her. Women watched her closely. Her predictions were not always welcomed, but they were remembered. Echoes often hide in law codes. In ancient Babylon, the Code of Hammurabi prescribed punishments for women caught committing adultery, but left more lenient terms for men. And yet, nestled in those tablets is a strange clause that a woman who was unjustly accused could leap into the Euphrates and let the gods decide her fate. If she survived, she was innocent. It sounds cruel, but it also hints that women had the right to confront divine justice themselves. And sometimes, women made the laws. Empress Wu Zetian in Tang, China, rewrote entire legal codes. She created systems for merit-based promotion, reduced punishments for orphans, and even commissioned biographies of other powerful women, intentional rewriting of memory across the world. In Ethiopia, Queen Gudit burned churches and emperors. She's barely mentioned in chronicles, but her name survives in lullabies and curses. Some say she ruled for 40 years. Others say she was a myth. Either way, she left scorch marks in the historical record. Even in stories written by men, there are cracks. Cracks where the light gets in. Take the Roman historian Tacitus. He wrote dismissively of Boudica, the Celtic queen who led a revolt against Rome. He called her wild and vengeful. And yet he recorded her, that fury, that flaming red hair, that vision of a woman standing in a chariot with her daughters beside her. Her words survive through the voice of a man who didn't admire her. Strange how memory works. In Maya glyphs, women are sometimes shown standing beside kings, not behind them. Glyphs whisper of queens who ruled alone, who led ceremonies, who were buried with jade masks and jaguar pelts. The stories aren't as complete as the kings, but they're there, and they shimmer. Even the bodies tell tales. In Anglo-Saxon graves, women were buried with keys, not swords, but keys. A symbol of domestic power, yes, but also control over treasure, storage, inheritance. She who held the keys held the means of survival. In some graves, the woman had richer goods than her male counterparts. Perhaps not a queen, but powerful in a quieter, older way. And when archaeology digs into abandoned hearths, it finds bits of charred food and beads things lost during laughter or labor. Echoes of women who may have never spoken publicly, yet shaped generations with their hands. Let's not forget the women who never wanted to be remembered, at least not in official ways. The witches, the poisoners, the widows with locked cabinets and strange herbs, the midwives who knew when to lie about a baby's birth time to protect its life, the herbalists who recorded moon cycles in secret, coded books. They're barely mentioned in court records, except when accused. But even then, their names linger like smoke. An Inquisition document from Spain mentions a woman who confessed to having knowledge passed from her grandmother and her grandmother's grandmother. They say she could speak to animals. She was burned, but her recipes lived on in the village for centuries, passed as whispers, used for coughs and fevers, and sometimes revenge. And in the crumbling walls of Pompeii, there's a graffito, scratched by a woman named Flora. I was here, and I was loved. Just that, nothing else, no lineage, no heroic tale, just a woman, loved. Once, there's something profoundly human in that kind of echo. Even now, scholars find scraps, a laundry list, a curse written in lipstick, a single sentence scribbled in a margin. She sang to herself as she worked. And suddenly, the past is less silent, as the candle burns lower and the ink dries on forgotten scrolls. We come to the quietest part of our journey, the place where memory slips between what was written and what was felt. Imagine this. The moon is rising over the tiled rooftops of an ancient city. Somewhere below, a woman is feeding animals in the courtyard. She pauses, brushes dust from her sleeve, and sings softly to herself a song her mother taught her, and her mother before that. No one records this. There's no scribe in the shadows, and yet it happened, and it mattered. That is the essence of women's history in the ancient world. Not always erased, but often unwritten. Passed through gestures, habits, rituals, and silences. Even today, in museums, we see rows of swords and spears, but the spindle whorls are kept in drawers. The loom weights, the bone needles, the cooking pots, they're there too. But who reads a recipe with the same reverence as a battle plan? And yet, which kept more people alive. Let's walk through a few more lives. In ancient Korea, court ladies, known as gungyunyo, managed royal households and secrets alike. Some became powerful advisors, hidden in silk and silence. One such woman, Shangjiam, rose through palace ranks to become the king's personal physician, an unheard of feat. Her story was passed down through generations of women, eventually inspiring folklore and even television dramas. But for centuries, she lived in whispers. In ancient India, women philosophers once debated in open forums. Gargi Vachanavi stood before kings and sages and asked questions that still make modern philosophers blink. What is the thread that holds the universe together? She asked, and who knows its length? Her name appears in the Upanishads, rare and brilliant, a single flame in a scroll of stars. Even the biblical world, often portrayed as rigidly patriarchal, offers strange flashes. The figure of the wise woman of Abel into Samuel, nameless negotiator who saves her entire city from siege by calmly outwitting a general. No sword, no spell, just strategy and a very sharp tongue. Sometimes women appeared in ghost stories. A Roman epitaph warns of a wife who will haunt any man who tries to remarry. A Babylonian clay tablet speaks of a wife returning in dreams to chastise her husband for forgetting the proper funeral rites. These stories aren't just eerie, they're echoes of power that refused to stay buried. Even lullabies contain history. A carved ivory rattle found in a child's grave in Thebes suggests a woman once soothed her baby with songs. What words did she hum? We don't know, but someone carved that rattle with care. The ivory was expensive. Love, it seems, defies social class. In China's Han Dynasty, we find letters on bamboo slips, one written by a daughter to her mother-in-law, apologizing for a failed recipe. The dumplings came out hard, she wrote. I added too much flour. I hope your teeth did not suffer. 1,000 years later, we smile. The past is still warm. And what of the women who never married, who lived on the edges, monks in disguise, wandering herbalists, teachers who trained girls behind closed doors? Their stories are barely there. But sometimes, a hairpin found in an unexpected place, a garment that doesn't match the expected role, a name scribbled on a votive offering. They were there, they mattered. Let us not forget the women whose labor built entire empires but whose names were never recorded. The ones who tilled soil, spun wool, dyed cloth, and brewed beer. A Roman brickmaker once stamped her name vitalicent to the wet clay. That brick survives. Her name endures, quite literally, in the walls of time, and perhaps, strangest of all, the women who were deliberately misremembered. Queens recast as witches, matriarchs diminished to footnotes, empresses blamed for downfall. Why? Because memory is power, and sometimes forgetting is a political act. But forgetting fails. Always. Because someone always remembers. A granddaughter finds a faded recipe tucked in a book. A scholar notices a pattern in burial sites. A storyteller wonders why a certain name keeps repeating in folk tales. And slowly, gently, the women who were never supposed to be remembered return. So now, as we drift into slumber together, think of the soft-footed lives behind the noise of history, the hand that passed the scroll, the eye that watched the king, the mouth that whispered the spell, the voice that hummed beside a fire. They are the threads that held civilizations together, still do. And so, dear dreamer, wherever you are, whether lying in bed, swaying in a hammock, or curled beside a fading lampy, leave you with the quietest truth. Even in silence, they sang. Even in darkness, they lit the way. Even now, they're with us. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with strange queens, secret poets, and the gentle rustle of skirts in forgotten corridors.